All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So again, welcome to the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics, and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development Seminar Series. Thank you very much for being with us in our seminar series, either morning or afternoon. Before we start, let me just remind you of our house rules. We will let the speaker finish his presentation first before we entertain questions. Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation. During Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. And before you ask your questions, please tell us your institutional affiliation. Participants on Facebook, please post your questions in the comment sections and we will read them out for you. Slides, videos, and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website only when the speaker gives their consent for sharing them. They are also posted in our Facebook page. Okay, we are very pleased to have Professor Euston Quah, who is Albert Winsemus Chair Professor of Economics and Director of Economic Growth Center at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is also the editor of the Singapore Economic Review and president of the Economic Society of Singapore. He has published widely in the fields of cost-benefit analysis, environmental economics, and in law and economics. Formerly Vice Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the National University of Singapore and headed the economics departments at both Nanyang Technological University and the National University of Singapore. Professor Quah has consulted for the World Bank, Asian Development Bank Institute, Resorts World, Gentings, and major Canadian organization. He continues to be advisor to many government ministries in Singapore. He is a recipient of the Singapore Public Administration Medal in 2020. His textbook with E.J. Mishan, now in its 6th edition, is regarded as a classic text in this subject and used by many universities and government. His other textbook on the Asian edition of the Principles of Economics with Gregory Mankiw and Peter Wilson is often regarded as a bestseller in Asia, now in its 3rd edition in 2021. So Professor Quah is here with us today to share his thoughts and his research on China's Belt and Road Initiative New Development and Research Agenda. So please help me welcome to the virtual floor Professor Euston Quah.
So thank you, Maja. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to hear and see some of my good old friends in Philippines, as well as thank those who have tuned in. This topic on China's Belt and Road is something which piques my curiosity. Some 1.5 years ago, when I was invited to Zhejiang University in China, right? They had a conference on Belt and Road. And so they asked me to say something about it, but I've not really done much at all, if at all, on China's Belt and Road. But I was interested to see whether I could apply my knowledge on cost-benefit analysis and environmental economics to this particular topic. And so it went quite well. And ever since that presentation, I've remained sort of tuned in to developments in this particular topic. And now I want to share with you what I think are further developments in this China's Belt and Road Initiative. So let me just share screen. Oh, we're on the share screen. So I want to center my talk in 3 focus areas. One is to look at the dynamics of the Silk Road from historical times to today, in particular focusing on the ancient Silk Road and China's Belt and Road Initiative. and then focusing on some new developments such as Health Silk Road, Digital Silk Road, and some issues of governance. And finally, round off with the third part of my talk, which deals with what I think are important, challenging new research agenda arising from the BRI, which from current literature, I don't see much of it being discussed, but I think these are important. And it opens up avenues for further discussion as well as for research. One is on the Nimby Syndrome, the other is using cost-benefit analysis, and thirdly, the arrival of competing initiatives. Okay, so let's continue. This is, I mean, there are many books on the ancient Silk Road. There are also a lot of documentaries you can see on TV and on YouTube and so on. But this is just a simple illustration of the ancient Silk Road. And China's BRI has its origins in this ancient Silk Road that connected Asia, Europe, Middle East, and Africa through this network of overland trade routes that led to a multitude of trade and cultural interactions. In fact, some authors, historians, have talked about this route as like an arteries, in our body, connecting all the major points. And it started around 200 before the Common Era and spanned 6,000 kilometers between China and the Hellenic world, as we understand it, the remains and the relics of the old Alexander the Great Empire. The Silk Road flourished in particular during the Tang Dynasty, which is around 618 CE to 907 CE. And it was complemented by the Maritime Silk Road, which provides the connection between the east with the west via the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Silk, porcelain, and lacquered produce were exported by the east, while pepper, flax, spices, and dried fruits flowed from the west. There were camel caravans, as you can imagine, carrying the goods from Central Asia. And despite all the African wars and the political turmoil in that part of the world, it was challenging, but yet people persisted because of the lucrative trade from the ancient Silk Road. And the Ming Dynasty sent off the famous Admiral Cheng Ho's expedition to the west in the 14th century. And by the 15th century, with the advent of more robust shipbuilding, the sea routes actually overshadowed this ancient Silk Road land route. Now, the term Silk Route, this route connecting east and west, was actually not a Chinese invention. Instead, it emerged historically by means of a mutual trade and cultural exchange across Europe, Asia. And it was a term that is actually coined by Ferdinand Baron von Richthofen, who is a German geographer in 1877. And hereafter, the term was sort of picked on and used by many countries in various initiatives. Let me see, let's continue. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative followed on to promote economic efficiency, mutual learning, world peace, enhancing human connectivity, financial connectivity, physical connectivity across Asia, Europe, and the African continents, here and their adjacencies as well. And this comprised of the Silk Road Economic Belt, which comprised of a variety of land routes that extend from China to Europe, and the Maritime Silk Road, MSR, which spans across the sea, linking southern coast of China with Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia, stretching across 3 continents involving 65 countries. So the BRI, as its new form, took up 40% of the Earth's total land area, 30% of the global GDP, 55% of total carbon CO2 emissions, and it has 60% of the world's population. Of course, there are some similarities and differences between the ancient Silk Road and the Belt and Road, and let me just note a few. and the slides here will tell you. The similarities are, we have technology transfers, which comprises of the gunpowder, paper, coating techniques, navigation tools, and medicine from the ancient Silk Road. And the BRI, in terms of technology transfer, is in terms of energy infrastructure, petrochemical refineries, and so on. Cultural exchange is another similarity, where in the old days, they talked about the spread of Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, and Islam. And then the BRI today is about the spread of Chinese language schools, building of museums, investments in cinematography, education, and student exchanges. And the third similarity has to do with migration of people. In the old days, it's mostly the traders and their families, but also included some craftsmen and missionaries. In the BRI today, it's mostly Chinese businessman class and migrant workers. Then there are the differences between the ancient Silk Road and the BRI. When people talk about the Silk Road, it's not a planned route. It emerged spontaneously, and it was maintained through challenges and sometimes wars and famines and difficult terrain. But they are maintained collectively. Whereas the BRI today, the initiatives is clear. It comes directly from China, motivated by energy security and concerns about decreasing productivity growth and excess industrial capacities, especially in the construction sector. Another difference has to do with investments. In the old days, it was difficult to build and maintain these roads connecting the East and West. But here today, the BRI offers financing for infrastructure. There were pandemics in the past. The Silk Road brought bubonic plague from southern China and Central Asia to Europe. But today, the BRI is leading in the pandemic response of COVID-19, and offers assistance to other countries through supplies, sharing of experience, expertise, building capacities in host countries, and so on. The scope is rather narrow in the old ancient Silk Road. The primary motivation was trade, but the BRI today has a wider scope, apart from just pure physical infrastructure, with the development of the health Silk Road, the digital Silk Road, and sustainable development. Now, there are 4 fundamental differences between the ancient Silk Road and the BRI. And these 4 are sustainable development, health Silk Road, digital Silk Road, and governance, risk, and diplomacy. And because of these 4 fundamental differences between the ASR, the ancient Silk Road, and BRI, these 4 challenges compel the BRI to keep evolving further and further into a more holistic connectivity plan that goes beyond just infrastructure, right? So it touches on all the 4 things that I want to talk about now. First, sustainable development. I think it must be noted that even before the BRI, China has already introduced a number of important strategies to protect the environment. I've always said before many times in other talks that no government will pursue and worship the GDP at all costs, right? You can't have a high income country, but then all your recreational and your leisure and your entertainment and all the rest are all negative. And you can't have all money and don't know where to spend it on, and it's also sometimes toxic. The air is toxic. You can't have go to swimming in a lake. You can't go out basically. So no government will pursue only just pure economic growth at the all expense of the environment. And China has suffered environmental degradation and pollution, and this has been noted over the decades. But China has come out stronger and stronger in terms of being very determined to manage this environment. And in fact, China in the recent decade has actually progressed quite a lot in terms of managing its environmental problems. So it has a lot of experience that it has gathered in the pursuit of economic growth and yet managing the environment. And we know that the BRI, there are many environmental and ecological effects, and they are quite inevitable, right? And so this is an opportunity for China to showcase their expertise and in that way to also provide some political sway in this area. And the BRI today also talks about adhering to international practices, which means that bringing in notions like CBA, environmental impact analysis, environmental valuation, and all these are important tools which can inform policy making and allows for sort of controlled economic growth and mitigating the environmental consequences of that growth. It is important to note that the BRI is not a case where you export all the dirty industries into out of China for efficiency gains, like the old pollution haven hypothesis. That is not true. So since the inception of the BRI, China seemingly stressed green development and ecological progress in conducting investment and trade, increasing cooperation in conserving the environment, protecting biodiversity. In fact, just last month, I think, there was a big meeting and Chinese President Xi Jinping has came out very strongly about the protection of biodiversity and also tackling climate change as appropriate as possible for China. Now, the Health Silk Road was conceived in 2016, and that followed from the Healthy China 2030 program, which basically argues that health is an important prerequisite for overall economic development, economic and social development. And this was taken to task and born to test during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And the Health Silk Road and its ideas and concepts, right, was put into practice because they make use of the transport networks and infrastructure that has been built under the existing BRI to deliver medical supplies where it would be harder if these infrastructures were not provided. There was also a donation of personal protective equipment like testing kits and ventilators, investments in health and technology such as telemedicine, right, and to reduce systemic vulnerabilities. So there was a symbiotic relationship between the Health Silk Road and the BRI. I think it is an important advancement here, and this also goes beyond just looking at infrastructure. As I said, it establishes a cooperative framework for public health crisis among the BRI countries, and this cooperation has borne to be quite fruitful in the course of this COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, it's a win-win situation in the sense that China is also benefiting from it because it involves China's expertise, China's medical equipment, China drugs, and health-related enterprises have also benefited in this particular support for the BRI countries. I have many details here, but I don't want to move into it. We can talk about it later during discussion if needed. Then there is a Digital Silk Road. Now, the Digital Silk Road was actually announced during the first official blueprint of the BRI in 2015, and it sort of takes on connectivity like providing information. So it creates an information type of Silk Road. So what does this involve? It involves bilateral cable networks, planning transcontinental submarine and cable projects, improving satellite passageways. And here the Digital Silk Road comprises of three basic aspects: digital infrastructure, digital exports, and digital future. And so digital infrastructure is providing clearer framework on especially like 5G networks, data centers, and this will create greater capacity for exporting all these systems abroad. It also advances the Made in China 2005 and China Standards 2035, and so on and so forth. Now, digital exports, opportunities for the establishment of full digital value chains from ICT companies to e-commerce platforms, including firms that are well established throughout the BRI geography, such as Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent. Now, digital future, well, moving forward, this digital Silk Road, one of the main priorities is the cooperation with some of the announced initiatives dealing with global initiative on data security issues. Governance. I think this is what we hear most from the media, which is that of the criticism of the BRI, that the BRI has debt trap diplomacy, debt trap problems, regional instability, and so on. It also talks about corruption, right? And so there were quite a number of criticisms labeled against the BRI, and China has recently pledged to reform it and concentrating on these three areas. I think the accusation, for example, by the US that the BRI is a cover for debt trap diplomacy, and through which China knowingly traps borrowing countries, unrepayable debts to gain political leverage. This has been said many times. But I think China has declared strong support for multilateralism and has actually declared to work with multilateral development banks, especially in the third world. I think the BRI, in its renewed form, in addressing the problems of this debt trap, emphasizes the importance of adopting all these multilateral rules and international best practices pertaining to project development, the procurement, the operation, and tendering and bidding process. I think it's also important to note that through these BRI countries may owe a lot to China's funds and so on, and become trapped in debt. But at the same time, it is not costless to China. Right? China is lending out a lot of money, and to these some of these developing and poor countries. Questions of risk of not being able to make good of their debt is also a potential cost to China, something which most people don't talk about, but it covers both sides. It's not just China imposing this debt trap for the BRI, but the BRI itself, with a huge amount of loans, could actually hold leverage against China as well. Now, there are regional instabilities, and this pertaining to implementation problems. With the help of Singapore, and this is where Singapore comes in, China is establishing a panel of international mediators from the BRI countries to resolve these disputes, including the cross-border disputes arising from projects under the BRI. And I think the idea is to provide some regional stability, and the idea is to accept that there will be reforms to the BRI. So several countries, including Pakistan, Malaysia, Myanmar, Maldives, and Bangladesh, have recently sought to review, to renegotiate, or scale down the BRI commitments, citing concerns, and there's a need, therefore, to reform the BRI and to bring also mediators like Singapore to resolve some of these problems and issues, and so on and so forth. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just to highlight another aspect, which is on corruption. On the socio-political front, you have the Beijing initiative from the Clean Silk Road that is mandating the BRI countries to fight corruption together with China, and this was endorsed as recent as 2019. Okay, and if you look up on this aspect, there are many path-breaking policy statements on anti-corruption practices, and it's quite rare for China to come up with this whole list of the anti-corruption measures. Okay, now I come to the section on the new research agenda, and this is what excites me, in the sense that when people talk about the BRI, when you talk about, let's start with the ancient Silk Road. When you talk about the ancient Silk Road, it's all about trade, the connectivity between East and West, the Central Asia involvement, challenges that one has to go through these trade networks and so on. It's all about trade. When you talk about the BRI, it's all about infrastructures, and along with this discussion of the infrastructures, the discussion is on environmental issues, discussion is on political issues and political economy issues. So there's very little devotion to this, what I call the new research agenda areas, which I think is pretty important. One is partly because of I had written before many papers, as well as culminating in the book. And you can see the book there called Citing Environmentally Unwanted Facilities with Casey Tan, Risk, Trade-offs and Choices. And this has to do with not in my backyard and the not in my backyard syndrome. So it's acronym NIMBY. And the NIMBY issue is particularly interesting because when you have all these infrastructures being built across the BRI countries, naturally the question is, where do you build them? And people are concerned that this infrastructure will have some externalities, negative externalities to especially the people living around them. But if you do a cost benefit for having this infrastructure for a country, then there is an asymmetry of the cost, right? And the gains. So the gains is for the whole country, the national consideration, and the cost is mostly borne by the people living around that infrastructure. And so that is the issue, that people in the country as a whole want the infrastructure because it benefits and pushes for more economic growth, which needs these infrastructures. But at the same time, they don't want these infrastructures to be sited near them because of all these negative externalities that can range from seemingly non-toxic to one that is threatening life and potential life and injuries. So there are many types of these infrastructures, from transmission stations to chemical factories to airports, and all these things have an impact on how they regard this siting issue, which I think is extremely important. And also, what happens? How do you deal with siting issues involving border issues when you put the infrastructure at the border area between one country and another BRI country? So this leads on to a whole research in the past on existing conflict resolution instruments. But this concept has never been applied to BRI countries. This concept of the Nimby Syndrome, and the existing conflict resolution instruments designed to deal with the NIMBY is mostly dealing with one particular country rather than across countries. So this is an important area. And here, if you want to do research on this, there are the usual existing conflict resolution instruments, such as regulations and zoning, public hearing, environment impact assessment, issuing of license and permits, mitigation policies, applying compensation for the local residents, and so on. But the idea is that we want to site this infrastructure in such a way that that elicits maximum acceptance by the local residents, so that the benefits of the infrastructure could be shared quickly to the rest of the country. And finding that where to site this facility is extremely important. So that is where the economist comes in, and economists have mostly contributed the idea of setting up auctions. So if you look again at the literature, whenever it comes to the siting issue of NIMBYs, economists such as Kleindorfer and so on, they come up with various schemes and types of auctions. Now, you remember when you go to an auction, and so you have one good being auctioned, the highest bidder will win. In this particular case, where you have a NIMBY facility, then it's the reverse auction, which is the lowest bidder who should win. And what is the bid here is in terms of, we know that when we site a particular NIMBY facility, it's going to create these negative externalities to a community. So the idea is that the community, as represented by the mayor or somebody, would then compute what would be the social cost in having to accept this facility. And then if it were deemed that the infrastructure will be built in, let's say, 5 cities chosen by the federal government, then the city with the lowest social cost will get to have the facility. And this negative externalities and the social cost will be compensated by the either the rest of the country or compensated by the federal government. So the idea is of this auction in the reverse sense is actually quite a good idea, in the sense that the infrastructure, which is a NIMBY, will be sited at a community which fetches the lowest social cost to society. So that's efficient. Now, so the early auction models that deals with this is basically just seal bid auctions to figure out what would be the lowest bid will win the siting of the NIMBY. However, the earlier models leads to strategic bidding. And so that is where the communities that bid for it realizes they're it's not just that it is a NIMBY, which means it may impose these negative externalities on them, but also the idea that perhaps two things can happen. One is that they made a mistake as to the calculation of the social cost, so there's a regret, and therefore they have to bump up the bid. Or two is that they realize that they could make surplus profit from this bidding, and so they'll bid high. And so these auction models then take on a second generation, which is to figure out how do you restrain this strategic bidding such that they don't overbid. Because if they overbid, then of course it's less efficient to a country. And so what they do is they come up with penalties. So the second generation auction models deals with all kinds of penalty situations. How do we impose this penalty, right? Is it the full penalty? Is it half penalty? Is it quarter penalty? And so if you look through this literature, there's a lot that offers these models on this idea of auctions. And this idea is, in a sense, a good one, because it forces people to think about efficiency consequences, and also it selects the site with the lowest social costs. Now, of course, there are difficulties in applying this, but I think it's a worthwhile to see how we could try to improve on the implementation of such a process. Partly because the worry is that the worry of the implementation stage is that there is difficulty in computing the social cost to begin with, and so that leads to a lot of errors in the computation, and therefore that may negate the gains from having this auction process. But I think it's still worthwhile for the new research agenda to see how we could improve on these auction models and then apply to the siting of a NIMBY, in this case, a siting of NIMBY in BRI countries, or even tackle the problem of regional NIMBYs. Now, the third one is involving stakeholders. So I have compiled a list of sort of references in the biblio, right? So you can look through it and you can see the list of papers that talks about these areas like conflict resolution instruments and auction models for you to study them in later, right? And those of you thinking of doing your graduate studies can perhaps think about these topics, which I think is pretty interesting. Now, involving stakeholders, I think regardless of this chosen conflict resolution instrument, the most important focus of any of these successful infrastructure project is the engagement of stakeholders. This is what I think is very much lacking, and that's why you have problems with the early BRI, especially on the success of it, right? So we need to ensure that stakeholders in all these BRI countries gains, or at least the issues of cost are being handled properly, and this would lead to lower opposition to the projects being built or being planned, and reaping these benefits and minimize delays from having this infrastructure. So the involvement of stakeholders can in fact create mutual benefits in a win-win scenario. Now we need to ensure this very little is talk about stakeholders. Actually, it's not true. It's a lot of talk, but very little being implemented. And so that is the issue here. The stakeholders' engagement, sharing of benefits, it goes beyond just policy dialogue and consultations. It needs to be action-oriented. And if the stakeholders are not handled properly, and the stakeholders, I mean, it's not just the country residents, but actually people living in the vicinity of the Nimby area. It also involves the neighboring countries, especially if the Nimby is sited close to the borders. It may also involve stakeholders like the funding agencies, not just for the country banks, but also the regional banks, including also the World Bank, Asian Development Bank. These are all stakeholders to come in. And we need to strengthen this involvement of stakeholders so that we get, everybody can see that by participating in the BRI, there are win-win, there's mutual gains for them, and that will smooth the implementation and the building of the infrastructure. So this is something which is actually not the specialization of economists, but involve other disciplines, but in fact trying to incentivize the stakeholders with schemes and models, and this is where economists can help. Now then I come to another new research agenda apart from Nimby, and that is the cost-benefit analysis. Then when we study cost-benefit analysis, the question is, most of these methodologies in CBA and so on, they come from the Western literature. So we get a lot from that. There are standard ways to do cost-benefit analysis. And there are, of course, options in choices of methods for valuation and so on and so forth. Now, the question that I pose is whether the literature the standard literature from cost-benefit analysis, can we apply them across all countries? In other words, is the framework of cost-benefit analysis as we know it today, as we know it from textbooks, will there be a big difference when you apply this technique to the developing countries? So is there a difference between poor and rich countries? So that's the question I pose. I published a paper in the Oxford Press, and that basically highlighted that there were differences between a developed country and a developing country. There are differences in labor markets, differences in goods market, and differences in financial markets. There are valuation issues. And so ultimately, one has to think very carefully, should the standard CBA be used as a decision tool for developing countries? Let me just go through one at a time. And take me another, let's see what's the time now, take another 2 minutes, okay? So when I talk about differences in labor markets, you know, in the poor countries, there's a lot of disguised unemployment in the agricultural sector. And when you build infrastructures there, you are drawing from mainly the irregular economy to the regular economy. So this has an impact on, for example, in your calculation of the wage rate, the calculation of the cost of the project. Should the wage rates be used to approximate the cost of the project, and so on and so forth. And also, there are higher levels of household production and also inefficient labor market. And what do you mean by inefficient labor market? It means that when we use wages, they may not be reflective of the true social opportunity cost. Also, when we do VOSL, value of statistical life, and we often tap on wage differentials, this may also be problematic. Now, differences in the goods market, we have it's also, the question of lemons. So there's greater information asymmetry. And in these poor countries, often the prices are distorted by taxes, by subsidies, and other forms of government intervention. There's distorted value of the inputs as well. and also incomplete values for externalities and non-market goods. And so that leads to things like related to the valuation issues. So whether review preference methods can be used, things that we learn, hedonic pricing, for example, are they a good method to be used in poor countries? So these are questions that we should be asking. Financial markets, differences in financial markets. So underdeveloped countries, they are less perfect, and they have greater market power of the private banks, and they are higher interest rates due to perhaps market power and also oligopolistic family banks and so on. So if we look at the issue of the discount rate which use the CBA, and there are two schools of thought: either we use the opportunity cost rate or Chicago method, or the trying to figure out what is society's time preference rate. In both instances, in the poor countries, you'll find that the social discount rate actually would be much higher than in a normal country. And so and if you use the time preference rate, for example, this is affected by how people look at life expectation. And society in poorer countries, life expectation is short, so they have a higher discount to accommodate for that. If you use the Chicago method, it's also lead to higher discount rates. So in both cases, it may bias in the choice of the discount rates, and discount rates are an important issue in cost-benefit analysis. However, of course, too low a discount rate will also result in overinvestments in the public sector versus the private sector. So should the cost-benefit analysis be used as a decision tool for developing countries? And the answer is definitely, but I think with three conditions. One is that the CBA should only be used as a guide and not the sole arbiter of projects, and care must be chosen especially to accommodate what would be the appropriate valuation techniques, and not just rely on market-derived prices such as review preferences. And even the issue of contingent valuation studies, which is used to value non-market goods, is also problematic because of the lower education of the people living in some of the BRI countries, and so they may not understand the questions as asked from the contingent valuation studies. And also in poorer countries in the BRI, there's also a great deal of inequity issues. So we know that cost-benefit analysis has to do mainly with efficiency basis, but in BRI countries, the problem of income distribution is also much more important compared to the normal countries. And so the issue of inequity arises, and inequity means that we have to think about how do we deal and accommodate with inequity in CBA. So it's a greater importance for that aspect as well. So this is a lot of issues that arise from cost-benefit analysis applied to the BRI countries. So I think it's a new research agenda where you focus on these differences between the poor and the rich countries, and how you can resolve these differences, and what kind of methods and adaptation perhaps adaptation of existing methods or new methods can be derived to look at these poor countries when you do CBA. In the interest of time, but the last part has to do with the recent developments in competing infrastructure, right? Such as the announcement of like in 2015, the Japan Asian Development Bank Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. As late as 2019, the United States, Japan, Australia has formed the Blue Dot Network, and the European Union, just as of September, announced its own upcoming global infrastructure bill. So all these things are happening, and if you just look into the literature on these new developments, it impacts on the BRI. I think the impact on the BRI is in a sense quite good, and is good because it forces the BRI to continue to innovate and to compete in a sense with other options offered to the BRI countries in these years to come. This is a win-win for everybody. So to round off very quickly, I think the important thing is we have traced the development of the BRI through the ancient Silk Road, but the BRI has taken new form. The BRI is not just infrastructure anymore. It involves both health and digital aspects. And we want to know something about those aspects and how it has performed over this, for example, during this pandemic for the health part and the digitization across the BRI. So the implementation is also important. And then the new research agenda comprises of the issue of the NIMBYs. It's not just purely environmental issues that we read from the press and also the literature, but it may involve more than the environment and thinking about the siting issues. And then the aspects of using CBA, since there are so many infrastructures across even these new competing initiatives, which ones to choose, all right? Because budget is limited, and yet there's a shortage of time because everybody wants, the BRI countries wants this, the economy to grow very fast with the infrastructure being built. So which infrastructure to build, what is the scale of the infrastructure, and that's where CBA comes in, offers an informed decision making. But the question is, should the CBA that we know today, should be applied differently to poor countries as compared to the standard conventional CBA in the rich countries? And the third one is the new things that's happening on these infrastructure initiatives. So how do we deal with it? What are those competing initiatives, and how does that impact the BRI? These are questions for future research. Okay, Maja, I think I'll stop here and entertain any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Euston. That's a very interesting presentation and offers a lot of very promising research avenues as well. I'd like to note that we have 56 participants here on Zoom and about 33 participants on Facebook, and already 16 shares on Facebook of the presentation. So to start off the discussion, we have a question on the chat box from Boying Bautista. Boying, would you like to ask your question yourself? Boying is a member of our faculty. Boying, are you there?
I'll read my first. I have two questions. I'll read the second one first.
Okay.
Would you be able to undertake cost-benefit analysis on BRI as a set of projects worldwide with various objectives, not only economic, but also geopolitical, and goals to be realized at different time frames and levels of uncertainty, and where the benefits are mainly for the investor, the BIR proponent, and national government?
Yeah, so you are saying that there's great deal of uncertainty and there's differences in asymmetry perhaps between the gains to the BRI countries and the gains to China and the rest of the world. Is that your particular question?
Yes, yes. And
yeah.
also whether the BIR as a whole package could be assessed with cost-benefit analysis, or is cost-benefit analysis simply limited to projects? So you have to add up all the various projects.
Yeah, in the Zhejiang conference, I did talk a little bit about the benefits, outlining what are the benefits of the BRI to the world and the BRI and the cost. But I don't have, of course, any actual studies in terms of, because the data is extremely difficult to obtain on this. So at the moment, I have no access actually on whether CBA has been done for particular infrastructure, but I'm sure there must be some. No country will just simply take an infrastructure without looking at what are the returns to the country and what cost they will have to incur. Now, having said this, at the same time, they may not do a complete cost-benefit analysis, but some incomplete form, especially through perhaps the returns of the financial investment, rather than looking at all the non-market good stuff, which I think is important for CBA. So in other words, the existing CBA, whether it's being done or not done, seems to focus more on the financial appraisal rather than a normal cost-benefit analysis. A normal cost benefit analysis will involve much more than a financial appraisal. Now, the other thing is you mentioned about uncertainty. Well, in the cost benefit analysis, we do have a step, one of the steps in the framework is to how to deal with uncertainty. So there are methods that deals with it. And of course, if you're talking about the entire BRI, I think nobody has done this entire BRI CBA. But the CBA for each particular country, there should be some that is done. It's just that we have no access to the data and so on. But I take comfort in the fact that the recipient country must have done some CBA in some sense. Nobody just simply say, okay, I take and I fall into debt. Unless, of course, you say there are lots of corruption going on and so on, then there's a completely different aspects to it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me check if others have questions first, and I'll get back to your other question, Wahing. Okay. Any other question from the audience on Zoom? Please unmute yourself and identify anybody. Okay, Wahing. Perhaps you can ask your second question.
My second question is, I don't know if it's political, you may say politically motivated, or it's a mischievous question. Did China include in her BIR infra program the construction of a number of military naval man-made islands in the West Philippine Sea? And did China apply extended cost-benefit analysis, including external costs, on these infra projects?
Well, I can't answer that question because it deals with the, this is a different kind of, I don't even know whether it's a NIMBY, but it's not a NIMBY. It's you're talking more about the naval bases and the issues in the South China Sea, for example. And this is a political type of question. And I would not value add anything to this particular aspect.
Yeah, that's why I said it may be a mischievous question.
Yeah, yes, it's not mischief, but it's a different topic.
Okay, anybody on Zoom? Okay, Nandi, would you like to ask your question? So Nandi is our former dean and professor at the department.
Hello, Euston.
Hello.
We should be meeting in the East Asia Economic Association. But the conference has been postponed already, I think twice. The question is, are you familiar with the CBA that the AIIB uses? And do you think your alternative kind of CBA will be acceptable to AIIB?
Yeah, so thank you. I have not personally seen the AIIB report, but I do know that I've seen some country reports. So for example, from Canada, from UK, from Asian Development Bank. All these reports tend to more or less follow the same conventional cost-benefit analysis. It's not something that surprises you. But of course, they offer some choices as to the methodology for valuation aspects. But they have, for example, guidelines on social discount rates and so on. These are pretty standard across a conventional CBA. And I think where one is not certain as to whether a particular number should be used or a particular method. And CBA, we use the common way is a sensitivity analysis where we try out a few of these and then see whether the overall final outcome would change. So if they don't change, that means quite robust, these studies, right? And so it's pretty standard. I don't think the AIB will be significantly very different, but I have no access to, I guess, to the, I don't read Chinese first of all. I don't know whether they are in Chinese, but you have raised an important question. So should I look at the AIB? Yes, I think I should after this talk.
Okay, thanks, Euston.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Randy has a question. Randy is our department chair.
Yes, good afternoon,
Hi, Randy.
Euston. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Well, my question is a little bit more general. It regards, well, it looks, my question is whether the commitment really to Belt, what do you think about the commitment of China still is on the Belt and Road Initiative? Because in the past few years, they've withdrawn from several projects, and there have been reports that the Chinese president seems to be less inclined to undertake strengthening relationships with countries abroad. So, well, there are reports that he hasn't been outside, for example, China since the COVID started. So, I don't know if this is a very general question. I mean, and if you would know the answer, what do you perceive to be the commitment really of China to the Belt and Road Initiative now?
Yeah. Well, I still think it's unwavering. It's just that China is now faced with so many issues, particularly to the pandemic, crisis and so on. So that may have taken a lot of attention away from the BRI. But BRI is certainly on the agenda of the Xi Jinping, and after all, it was his idea that he wanted it. And looking at it very neutrally, I think this idea is a good idea, that it opens up and reminds people of the very successful ancient Silk Road that has transpired in the past. It's just that the ancient Silk Road was rather uncoordinated, a bit dangerous along the route, but it does bring about some successful trading, connectivity between East and West. It opens up cultures, education, exchanges. They're all the various plus points of the ancient Silk Road, which now in the current format of the BRI, although it started not very well because there are trial and error, as between China and the BRI countries, and even the practices that were done by the Chinese companies were often blasted because they bring in their own people. And so I mean, I can also understand why they do that and bring their own people and so on, because they are used to the way they work and the efficiency aspects, So they are so used to that they think that they want to build this infrastructure as fast as possible, but they don't realize that one of the things that they have to make it successful is to get the stakeholders especially the people, right, to welcome the project and to be part of it and to see the gains that actually trickle to them. And so because of all these early problems, and you can see that at each annual meeting of the Chinese Assembly, they will talk about these criticisms and how they deal with it, including the latest one about biodiversity. And so, of course, they have to walk the talk in a sense, but it is not perfect. It takes time. It takes trial and error, as I said. But there is a commitment that has been put out by the Chinese government. And I think in many of these BRI countries, they really lack the infrastructure and they need funds and support the infrastructure. So why couldn't it be seen as a gain-win situation? So it's not easy, as you say. It's not clear-cut. Some people perceive it as though it's a political domination and so on. But I would like to see from the economic perspective, I like to see that it leads to the improvement of welfare between the poorer countries and one that is China, which is a richer country, with all the experience that it has. And it should be sharing that experience with the rest of the world, even if it means there's some influence from the way the Chinese do things and so on. But it's a learning. And this BRI and the ancient Silk Road is this exchange of ideas that leads to a better concept. So I'm very optimistic. I'm still optimistic about the Chinese commitment to the BRI. I think this will get back on track once this pandemic crisis is over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have several visitors actually this afternoon. Maybe we can hear from them. Who has a question? You may just unmute and show yourself. Let me just scroll the screen. Anybody? Euston, maybe you mentioned several research avenues in your presentation. So for the graduate students, and what do you think would be, because you also mentioned the accessibility of data. I mean, if they're going to use this for their dissertation,
Yeah.
what would be their first thing to look at?
Yeah, so I was thinking that they should focus on particular infrastructures. That probably they could get better feel to it, especially if we have international students coming from the BRI countries, and there are certain infrastructures being built in those countries. So one way, if you like to focus only on infrastructure, I'm sure that like any infrastructure, you can do some cost-benefit studies on it. You can invoke combine that with some sort of environment impact analysis, some sustainable development issues. But at the same time, I was talking about this Nimby syndrome. So is there a Nimby syndrome in your country, for example? And what kind of Nimby syndrome that arises because of the infrastructure, right? What were the things that they're concerned about? So things like, even for example, in the literature, economist Bruno Frey some years ago talked about one useful conflict resolution instrument is just pure compensation. But pure compensation could take the form of monetary compensation as well as non-monetary compensation. And he found from his studies that if the NIMBY infrastructure facility is not life-threatening or injurious to health, then people can usually, from his findings, that people will accept the NIMBY infrastructure with compensation. But if they are life-threatening and so on, they will think that the government is trying to bribe them with monetary compensation and so on. So they will reject it. And so it becomes harder for the government to locate the NIMBY in a particular area. So issues like this, which he calls the bribe effect, issues like this could be tested. For example, if you're interested to do this research on a particular infrastructure in a country. So it goes beyond just BRI. It's maybe localized to even within the Philippines on talking about NIMBYs. But this issue of NIMBY is very interesting. And we could borrow, can we study what has happened to, let's say, I think Germany, or is it Germany? They were building some nuclear power facilities and along the borders, right, between Germany and Poland. So how do they resolve these issues? And also the North American NIMBY. So there are many things that we can learn from the Europe and North America. So how do we import these studies, how they resolve their conflicts into the BRI countries? And I think if you can get instances, some formula of success and some of the things to look at, it'd be very useful for the local governments to study all these differences in resolving conflict resolution instruments.
Yeah, I was going to say in the Philippines, we have the Bataan nuclear power plant, and it's also the case. It's reopening, and also coal power plants in other areas.
Yes.
Okay.
But rather than just focusing on infrastructure, as I said, now he has taken off a different kind of connectivity to the digital and the health. These are two new aspects which is not touched upon by many economists. And this area where the students can spend time to think what constitutes digital BRI, what constitutes the health BRI, and in what ways it could bring about a higher level of welfare to the BRI countries.
Yeah, thanks. We can entertain one more question. Siwage Ngara is raising his hand. Please tell us your institutional affiliation, and you may show yourself.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Maha and Professor Euston, for your very excellent presentation, as always. I'm Siwage Nagara from ICS. I met Prof. Euston in the past several times, and I'm very happy to listen to your presentation this afternoon.
Thank you.
My question is, with regard to BRI projects, how do we consider about the externalities from the BRI project? For example, if there's a construction, there's a direct impact on the land price inflation. So shall we consider this land price inflation as a cost or as a benefit of the project?
Sorry, what the
Okay,
land price? What?
inflation.
Oh, inflation.
Because because when the projects started, usually we
Yes,
can notice
understand.
that the price of land become very expensive.
Yes. So when
So is this part of the cost or the benefit of the BRI project then?
yeah, so if it depends on if we are doing the cost benefit side, you have on the cost side, right? These are like when you need the land is a kind of like land capital and labor. They're inputs to a production. So when infrastructure needs this particular resources, they have to price these resources as best as possible to the opportunity cost, right? And so the cost inflation over time will just reflect that into the cost benefit calculation. So the price where you devote that part of the resource, which is land in this case, to the enterprise when the project that is built. But if you are thinking about, well, the landlords may gain and so on and so forth, from this, but it's just a transfer in that sense, some of the gains. But important point is not what these landlords gain, but rather the cost requiring this land for input into the project, and that cost may not be the same from year to year, if depending on the size of the project. You need to acquire more and more land to expand on the project over time, because then of course you have to take into account of the increases in price for the project. But I guess the important point is that yes, we do take into account of, just like you take into account of the economic growth over time, you take into account of the price increases whenever you have the inputs of the project. That includes not just the land, but other resources used as well.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's all the time that we have for the question and answer. So at this point, I'd like to invite everyone to turn on their camera so we can have a photo opportunity with Professor Euston. So while you are turning on your camera, let me invite you to several events. So we will be participating in the Philippine Economic Society Conference. So we have energy session, energy economics, natural gas, electric vehicles, force outages, and forward markets. This will be on November 11th. And then we also have a session on economic issues, exchange rates, employment, labor protection, and COVID-19. This will be on November 12th. So registration details is at the bottom, and it can also be found on our Facebook. And then the week after that, we will have our seminar with the speaker, Professor Norita Rui, who is also with us this afternoon. And for materials of the previous seminar, please visit our website.